Oh, welcome back to Ethical Adulthood. Today we're discussing power, which is the third capacity. So, recognizing power and taking responsibility for its effects. Power exists whether we think about it or not. And for this conversation, I'm not mainly talking about governments, billionaires, or dictators twirling their mustaches on private islands in the middle of the sea. I'm talking about relational power. The kind that shows up between ordinary people every day. People who are partners in business. People who are friends. People who are married to each other or living together. Co-workers. Power determines who carries the consequences when relationships strain, rupture, or require repair. We often know who has more power in a classroom, in a courtroom, in a boardroom, and even like in a restaurant. We don't need a lecture on relationships where power is understood as unequal. It's operating, and we proceed accordingly in alignment with who we are. More on this when we talk about acting without certainty, the fifth capacity. But for our purposes, we need to look at how ethical adulthood means realizing that power is often operating in the background when nobody really thinks it is. And when nobody is paying attention to power, real harm can occur when it doesn't have to be that way if we know the terrain. Let's think about this together. There are relationships that look equal on the outside. A marriage that's spacious, calm, and egalitarian for the most part. Two co-workers who take lunch together once or twice a week. Two old friends who've known each other for a long time. Because when we think of ourselves as equals in a relationship, we stop asking whether the consequences of a rupture are actually equal. We just automatically think they are. Here are a few stories to get you oriented. John and Sally are in their early 30s, and they've been married for about 6 months. And like many newly married couples, they're negotiating the ordinary costs of building a shared life. Money, chores, what to do with their free time, and whose preferences matter when. They've been thinking that they're in an equal partnership. But here's the underlying power dynamic they may not be processing. A few months ago, Sally's dad passed away and left her several $1 million. John's a doctor, newly minted. His income is stable, but it's on the low end, for now at least. Sally has quit her job as a financial advisor after 10 years of working at a brokerage, and she's decided to stay home and run the household. The garden, the pets, lawn care, booking appointments, taking care of things. A few more months go by, and Sally decides she really wants to leave the country. Like, seriously, leave the country. Spain, maybe. Maybe Denmark. John is hesitant. He's never left Michigan. They start to bicker about this every weekend. Who has more power here? One more. Peter and Bob have been friends for 30 years. They're both attorneys, but Peter is a partner at a large law firm, while Bob works for the state in the district attorney's office. A few years ago, Peter borrowed $50,000 from Bob. And even though you'd think lawyers would know better, there was no promissory note, just a handshake and a promise to repay it within a year. The repayment never comes. And Bob never pushes the issue because he can survive without the money, and because somewhere in his mind, friendship's supposed to matter more than bookkeeping. Well, years go by. Peter keeps making more money than Bob. The subject quietly disappears. Then one afternoon, Peter calls and he asks Bob for a favor. Peter's son has gotten into legal trouble after driving drunk through a subdivision and damaging several homes. Peter's son has priors. Peter wants Bob to represent him, or at least pull some strings, help out however he can. And suddenly, Bob feels something he hasn't fully allowed himself to feel before. I mean, for years, Peter was the more powerful person in the relationship. Peter had more money, he had more prestige, more influence, more access. But now Peter is the one needing something. Now Peter is the one with uncertainty in his life. And Bob realizes something making him uncomfortable. Peter still thinks this relationship is operating on loyalty. Peter still thinks this relationship is made up of two people standing on equal ground. But they haven't been standing on equal ground for a very long time. And the imbalance just became visible when the consequences of rupture changed. Most of us were never really taught how to recognize power in real time. We're taught to think in simpler categories. Who's right? Who's wrong? Who's nice? Who's mean? Who's getting emotional? Who's staying calm? But power is often operating underneath all of that. For example, if I can leave a conversation where you've asked me for a favor and take my time answering, I have more power in that moment. If I can wait 3 days to text back, and you spend those 3 days dysregulated and unable to focus, power is operating there. If we both tell the same story about how we were treated at the farmer's market, and people are just more likely to believe me because of my role, my status, my education, confidence, money, whatever. That's power. And if something goes wrong between us and I recover quickly while you carry the consequences much longer, that's power too. So, yeah, power is not always about domination. Often it's leverage. Like, I have VIPs in my contacts and you don't. Insulation. I have a large family that will gather around me every day and you're alone. Options. I don't miss pay if I take a day off work. You cannot afford to miss a day from work. Mobility. I have 2 cars. You have to rely on public transportation. The ability to absorb consequences more easily is what frames power dynamics. And to be honest, the person with more power will often feel less emotional intensity. That's why they look calm. It's not necessarily because they're right. The calmer person in a conflict is not automatically the more ethical person. Sometimes they're simply the more protected person. I mean, calmness looks like wisdom, but calmness can also just be insulation. And because of that, people with more power, they often experience themselves as just being reasonable. Meanwhile, the other person feels overwhelmed, gets emotional, can be reactive, or look desperate. Not necessarily because they're irrational, but because in that relationship, the stakes are different. Okay, we need another story. Mary flies from California to New York to visit her old college friend, Mark. They've talked about the trip for weeks beforehand on the phone. Restaurants, museums, a loose itinerary, right? When Mary arrives at her hotel and calls Mark, he doesn't answer. So she sends a text. And she leaves a voicemail. 2 voicemails. Another text. No response. Like 24 hours go by before Mark finally responds. He barely apologizes. And when they eventually meet up, he's warm and friendly, exactly as he's always been. But Mary is so destabilized by the experience that she can barely enjoy the trip at all. And here's the important part, the point that I want to make. Mark may not have intended any harm. In fact, it's almost certain that he did not intend to harm Mary. But one of the biggest mistakes we make in relationships is confusing your intention with your impact. Because impact still exists, even when nobody meant for anything bad to happen. I mean, I didn't mean for that to happen. Maybe. But you made a contribution to a situation where someone was harmed. The consequences were not equal. Ethical adulthood asks us to stay in the conversation long enough to care about what actually happened, not just what we intended. And sometimes we look at a situation with someone we're in a relationship with, and we see symmetry where symmetry doesn't actually exist. We may ask the other person to resolve this way. Let's meet halfway. And that sounds mature and fair, unless one person started 10 miles behind the other. So, when we have conversations about power like this, they can become uncomfortable. Because once we recognize that there's an imbalance, we have to also recognize that responsibility shifts. If I have more power in a situation, then I have more responsibility. Not because having more power makes me a worse person. Not because I should disappear if I have what's viewed as privilege, and not because my needs don't matter. If I have more power in a situation, then I have more responsibility because I have more room to make repairs without causing more harm. If I can absorb more without destabilizing, then ethically, it's probably mine to absorb more. And honestly, sometimes I know that feels unfair. Sometimes our mind immediately presses us. Why do I have more to do here? I'm hurting too. But that question itself is often revealing something important. Power becomes most visible the moment we have somebody's feelings in our hands. Now, this does not mean tolerating abuse. It doesn't mean accepting false accusations. It doesn't mean abandoning boundaries. It doesn't mean becoming emotionally self-erasing. Power awareness is not self-destruction. It's accuracy. It's being able to say, this situation is affecting us differently. This lands differently because the stakes are different. And I may not be wrong, but I still hold more weight here. And frankly, this gets harder right now because culturally we're really confused about power. We often think power only counts if it's formal or obvious, like money, titles, authority figures. But relational power can come from many places. Competence, beauty, education, social fluency, institutional backing, moral certainty, the ability to leave, the ability to stay calm under pressure, and even being the person that everybody already assumes is credible. Sometimes professionalism is just power wearing cargo pants and a sweater. And sometimes vulnerability itself becomes power. Which means this is not a simple framework of good people versus bad people. Power moves around. It changes by context. I mean, a teacher has power in a classroom. A student may hold social power or institutional power based on her last name. A parent may hold financial power. A teenager may hold emotional leverage. A yoga teacher may have authority they don't even realize students are granting them. So let's not feel any collective guilt over power relationships we may have misread. The point is awareness, because without that, we default to protecting ourselves before orienting to reality. Typically, we rush toward defending ourselves, using fairness language. Everybody's opinion matters equally. We'd rush toward neutrality. All things are the same, really. Self-justification. Or all the intellectual arguments we have about why we do the things that we do. We rush toward those things before we've actually asked, what is happening here? Who has fewer options? And who absorbs the larger consequence? And one of the clearest markers of ethical adulthood is this ability to tolerate seeing that clearly without collapsing into shame or self-protection, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. So maybe one useful question is this: if I act exactly as I want to right now, is it I who absorbs the cost? Or will my decision disproportionately affect that other person? If I can be completely fine, but the other person will suffer when I do what it is I want to do, then power is probably operating, and the greater responsibility for repair falls to me. And before we end this episode on power, I want to say something about capacity. Because once we start talking about responsibility, especially in terms of power imbalances, it's easy to hear this as a demand to do more or to do everything. And that's not what this framework is asking. So before we go further into the fourth capacity, which is grief, we need to get clear about limits, about what is actually available to us in a given moment. So the next capacity will be actually 3.5 before we get to the fourth capacity. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.